So I think we're all here. Thanks so much for joining us. Just in case anyone missed the first session, I'll just very quickly introduce myself. I'm Harry Thurkettle. I'm Head of Operations at MyMHealth, and my role really involves helping the NHS customers that we work with get the most out of our platform. I also just happen to have brought up my own product on the MyMHealth platform called MyOp, and I'm currently trying to work out how to generate evidence to support its use. So it's been a really fascinating session. So I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of our audience in passing on my thanks to each of you for those wonderful presentations. And for me, it's a real privilege to be able to share a stage with your collective intellect and experience. I'm sure there's a lot of benefit which the audience has taken from it. So how we're going to run this session, I'm going to instead of just doing introductions all at the start, I'm going to come around to each of you in turn. If you could do just a quick introduction, and then I've got a little starter question for each of you, which we can go through. And then hopefully we'll have time to do a Q&A from the audience afterwards. So everyone who's listening, there's a little chat column on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a Q&A tab there. Feel free to put any and all questions into the Q&A, and we'll come to them towards the end of the session. So please take advantage of that as an opportunity. Okay. Excuse me, sorry, somebody's trying to call me. So let's start, if that's okay, with you, Izzy. So would you mind just giving a brief introduction to yourself?
Okay, thanks, Harry. So yes, I'm Izzy Redding, and I'm Professor of Medical Statistics at the University of Southampton. And alongside that, I'm Director of something called the NIHR Research Design Service. So particularly for this session, one of the things that the Research Design Service can help with is groups of people, particularly SMEs, who are looking to get funding from places like Innovate UK, NIHR, probably their I4I funding stream, and other places like that. So I've got quite a bit of experience of sort of being on the side of reviewing the applications that will go off to those funders. And so, you know, with my eye as a statistician, that is in part what I'll be looking at. As well as that, as I'm a collaborator on various projects, and at the moment in particular, I'm collaborator on an I4I Product Development Award. So I have some experience there of a device that has gone into humans for the first time, and working out the kind of study design and statistics that you might have around that.
Perfect, thank you, Izzy. And just to get us started then, and so what are the main pitfalls and challenges you see for SMEs when they're trying to generate evidence to support the use of their products? And perhaps, given you mentioned applications for grants there, maybe some of the common mistakes or pitfalls within you know, grant applications that people make?
Okay, so I think from the kinds of things that I see, I think a big one, which has been mentioned in various other contexts as well, is not taking into account carefully enough the setting where technology will actually be used. So your product's a great example, because you started off with the clinical setting, and you know, you had that very much in mind. But I guess we see a lot of people who've got their great product, they're working on the techie side of stuff to say it works, this is brilliant. But actually, that's very different from saying that overall it works for patients, for clinicians in an NHS system. So I think, particularly say with digital health, you may have quite a lot where things have an element of monitoring about them. And so a company will do a lot about the information flow and checking that it works. But it's, well, what happens to that information? You've got all this flow of information, but what's the NHS or the clinician supposed to do with that? And that might mean a change in systems at their end. And then that becomes part of the whole parcel of what the offer of the technology is. And you then have to take that into account as well. So it does become a bit of a bigger question, and it's, you know, quite a long way from statistics, but I'd say that's quite a big thing, is thinking about the whole picture of how you're expecting your technology to work. So I think that's a big pitfall that we see a lot, people being very sort of quite narrow in thinking about what they mean when they say their technology works. And I think a particular challenge, which I guess is related, is that there are just so many different audiences. So when you're thinking about evaluation, what an NHS as a potential buyer might want to see in terms of evidence may be different from what a user would want, whoever that user is, whether that's clinicians, patients, and may be different from what a company is trying to get at that moment in time. So I think you've got to work out what's the audience that you've got at a particular moment in time, and how are you going to please them and give them the information that they want. In terms of grant applications more generally, I guess the biggest thing is, and this is probably true of lots of things, is that companies know so much about their own technology, and it's very hard to get that onto a really restricted piece of text to go to people like me who know nothing about that particular area, and to really get across the importance and the potential. I think the potential is really important, and that is where having some, say if you're at the stage of having some pilot data to say this has promise, is so key, and can cover a lot of other areas where you may not have the text to say what you want, but data can speak quite loudly.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Izzy. It's wonderful insight. Tom, if we could come to you next, would you mind just giving a brief introduction to yourself?
No, thanks very much. So I'm Tom Clutton-Brock. I'm Professor of Anaesthesia and Intensive Care Medicine in Birmingham, although I stepped back from frontline clinical work 4 years ago. And so I'm the Clinical Director of the NIHR Trauma Management MedTech Cooperative. I'm the Director of the Medical Devices Testing and Evaluation Centre, and I'm Chair of Interventional Procedures Advisory Committee at NICE. So I spend my career pretty much around the sort of the MedTech side of things. I have a background. I spent 12 very amusing but very part-time years at the MHRA. So I have a sort of reasonable working knowledge around the regulatory side of things. And as I think I said in my talk, that the bread and butter of what we do has been to fill that gap in usability testing, particularly in the preclinical phase. And so that's what I spend most of my days doing.
Excellent, thank you. And if we could just start with a question for you. So I think you've covered some of this in your talk already, but why do you feel usability testing is important, and what advice would you give to an SME or a new founder trying to bring a product to market around usability testing? And I wonder if I could just add a slight caveat to the end of that as well. I noticed your talk, you focused a lot on the kind of hardware side. So anything in your answer which you could relate back into the digital and software side would be amazing as well.
Yes, I mean, I mentioned a bit about AI, just to end up with that bit first. So about 50% of what we do now is software as a medical device, or devices with software. So that's, I mean, a rapid expansion of what we do. But the requirements are much the same. I think probably the three main things why you should do usability testing are probably not the reasons that people necessarily do it in that order. The top one is patient safety. So at the end of the day, the real concern is that when technology gets out there and it's used on patients, it should be safe and it should do what it says it's going to do. And we know from some of the figures I gave you that being difficult to use or poor training is a key component in patient safety, and patients get killed by devices that are difficult to use. So I think that has to be the key number one reason for doing it. The second, I think, is reduction in cost of bringing things to market. The cost of bringing technology to market that then subsequently is either not what we want, which is you covered very nicely, not what we want or we can't use, or doesn't any great benefit, is hugely expensive, as is the reputational cost of bringing technology to the market that then doesn't work or we don't want. The NHS is incredibly unforgiving. You know, if you bring something to market these days and it doesn't work or it causes a problem, we won't go back and look at it again. We have a great reputation of that. And I think the final one, which is one of the reasons that people come to us, is because of the increase in the regulatory requirement for usability testing. So it's actually slightly back to front, but I think patient safety, reputation and reduction in cost, and then finally is getting regulatory approval.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tom. Gurdeep, if we come to you next for your introduction.
Thank you, Harry. So yeah, my name is Gurdeep Sagoo. I'm a lecturer in health economics at the University of Leeds. So I'm based in the academic unit of health economics, which is part of the Leeds Institute of Health Sciences, and we're in the School of Medicine. I'm also, I guess for the purposes of this, a health economist, and I'm the deputy theme lead for the health economics theme in the NIHR Leeds in vitro diagnostics MedTech cooperative, so MIC. And I'm also the Yorkshire and Humber RDS advisor for MedTech as well.
Excellent, thank you, Gurdeep. And again, I think you covered some of this in your talk, but what kind of practical advice, or how would you go about gathering evidence and structuring a health economic case to support the procurement of a new product?
Yes, no, it is a good question. One of the first things I'd probably do is to try and find your local friendly neighborhood health economist. We are also superheroes, by the way. Yeah, you want to try and find your local friendly health economist and start discussions. I don't think there is any point that's too early, really, because we can think about hypotheticals. It was really interesting watching the other videos because, you know, there are so many relevant points mentioned by everyone. So Harry, you talked about thinking about the patient health, you know, outcome, thinking about the clinical pathways and the patient journey. So when, as a MedTech developer, you're thinking about your value proposition, these are the sorts of things that you really want to try and understand, and then try and convey that to the health economists so that they can start thinking about, okay, what is it that we're trying to value? So that we can undertake an evaluation. As a developer, you want to really try and understand, you know, the production side and the cost side of your technology, because that basically gives you a baseline below which you cannot go unless you fundamentally change the value proposition of your technology, and that's really useful to know. It's also really important to know about competitors, because in an economic evaluation, we're normally comparing a technology to another technology. So if you understand your competitors, that's really useful. And yeah, undertake early economic evaluation. You know, as part of that, you can undertake another type of analysis, which is called value of information analysis. And this basically allows you to think about evidence generation and reducing uncertainty, decision uncertainty. And that then allows you to think about, okay, so what additional research do we need? How do we go about doing that research? And is it cost effective? Is it worthwhile doing that research to reduce the uncertainty? And also sometimes when you're quite early in development, you want to think about what are the different scenarios and sensitivity analyses that you want to undertake, and they may be more important than, you know, the base case analysis. And so this is something that was mentioned, I think, by Anastasia as well, you know, thinking about what outcomes we are interested in and how we capture those. So it's really useful with the other talks as well.
Excellent, thank you so much for that. And Anastasia, if we can come to you now for your introduction.
Thank you, Harry. So my name is Anastasia Halkizu. I'm the Associate Director for the Medical Technology Evaluation Program and Intervention Procedure Program at NICE. The MTech program specifically is one of the two programs alongside diagnostics that probably get the bulk of digital health technologies to evaluate and produce guidance on. And I guess for the purpose of today's talk, I did spend quite a big chunk of my career before joining NICE working with MedTech companies and digital health interventions developers to support the value proposition and their evidence generation strategy.
Thank you for that. And so Anastasia, in relation to the kind of NICE evidence standards, or more generally, having heard of your background, what advice would you give to SMEs on going about making a plan of their evidence generation? What would the kind of considerations you would take into account?
Yeah, and that's a very important question. And I guess the first point is to actually frame it as an evidence generation strategy. I think one of the most common mistakes that we see either working with developers or when a portfolio from one of the products comes to NICE for evaluation is that in some cases that strategy has not been put together upfront. And what happens is you have more kind of standalone studies that they aim to address an outcome or a subpopulation or a wider population. And it's very difficult to, from a NICE point of view, when you actually have the portfolio and you're assessing the evidence during the evaluation, to do that in retrospect, to put that coherence of the evidence that you've seen in front of you to support the value proposition. So it needs to be done upfront. And I think the MICs are an excellent example of an environment that can support that. And something to point out for the evidence standard framework, especially because it's one of the very, very few that exists out there for MedTech, is that it aims to provide a general guide, but you still need to figure out the details. And by engaging with the clinical experts and the users, and you need to, the framework is cumulative. So by the time you reach the final tiers of that framework, you are supposed to follow through the steps to develop those evidence on a cumulative fashion, if you like. And sorry, just one last point. And I tried to make that point during my presentation as well, that probably it's good to move away from fixating so much what the study design should be, and if that should be a randomized controlled trial. I think there is a general anxiety out there about randomized controlled trials. I think you should work with the methodologies to figure out what is fit for purpose. And the new methods updates that the NICE is currently going out for consultation and will be finalizing hopefully by the end of the year will also provide guidance on what expectations we have for surrogate outcomes, what expectations we have for real-world evidence and other aspects outside randomized controlled trials to support, I guess, companies.
Yeah, fascinating insight. I know certainly at my Health, that's been very much our experience. Your first point around it really is a strategy, right? It's not, oh, I'm going to do one trial and then that's the end of the road. Having real world evidence of impact, building on your trial data, and having a concerted effort is really so important. So thank you so much for that, Anastasia. David, if we could come to you now for your introduction. Your screen's a bit dark, David. You're kind of a silhouette, but hopefully we'll be able to hear you okay.
It looks fine on my screen. Hold on, I'll try to fix this. Does that help?
Slightly.
Okay. Right. Good afternoon. I'm David Krell. I'm your extra panelist today. Hopefully you can see me a little bit better now. I'm the Director of Insight at the Wessex Academic Health Science Network, the AHSN, but also the implementation lead at the Wessex ARC, Applied Research Collaborative. Two titles for kind of doing the same thing, just different audiences. ARC side is academics, AHSN is more for clinical innovators and industry. And what we do, what the Insight team does at the AHSN is, I guess, in a nutshell, address the pitfall that Izzy quite nicely summarized of trying to get that whole picture. So it's about going beyond the technical requirements that have been mentioned by everybody else, the NICE requirements, ISO requirements for CE marking, the health economic kind of value proposition, the MHRA, and it's really about looking about the process inside and being able to replicate what has been done in a trial in real life. And the good news is that just like all of the other panelists, there are frameworks out there for doing that. There are frameworks for doing effectively implementation science. So there's an entire field of science based on failure, based on innovations that have not done very, very well. Academics have poured over that, put together a lot of frameworks to prevent or to help other innovators to avoid the same issues. So you might as well learn from that and use those frameworks to gather evidence at the same time as the clinical evidence is being gathered this evidence around implementation that allows increases the chances of successful adoption and then further spread to the NHS.
Yeah, thank you. And just building on those concepts, David, so when you're generating evidence, what do you see as the difference between trial and real world evaluations, and how do they fit together? So
the trial evidence is really coming across very outcome oriented, and is trying to hit those specific milestones to reach the endpoints that have been specified by different regulators and different organizations. So what we consider the real world evidence is the data that fills in between that and understands how something happens. So it's about how the innovation has worked or not worked in terms of impact on patient, staff, health, and the care system, not the direct impacts of your innovation, but any downstream effects or any unexpected effects. And then looking at why did it work or why did it not work? So it's really process oriented, evaluating the process of implementation in real time. And again, that's about trying to help the innovator save money down from having to change things down the line. And then from all of that, you can put that together into a methodology, into a kind of a how-to guide, which is about identifying the active ingredients that enable your innovation to be able to scale. So it's about facilitating spread and adoption. And a lot of this comes back to the audience. And so it's about trying to put together a package that is understandable mainly to the clinical teams and to the commissioners, the people who are trying to purchase this, and get this across to them.
Excellent, thank you so much. So I think now we're going to open up to some more questions, and I might be cheeky and just slip one of my own in there to Gurdeep. Just building on what David was talking about there, from a health economic perspective, how do you see the difference between trials and real world evidence playing together to make a health economic case? Could you comment on that at all?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like Anastasia said in her presentation, it depends. You need horses for courses, basically. If you're depending on what you're trying to demonstrate and what you think you need evidence for, you may need an RCT, and there may be no way of getting around that. But if you don't need an RCT, why do you want to undertake one? Because they take a long time, they're expensive. So depending on what you need, that is the type of study design that you should go for. And Izzy related, she mentioned that in her presentation as well. And one of the things that the RDS does is around thinking about, okay, what is it you actually need to demonstrate, and what is the best study design for that. In terms of health economics, we evaluate. We can do modeling and we evaluate RCTs undertaking a within trial analysis, but we can also do modeling on top of that as well. So in health economics, like Anastasia mentioned, we're not averse to taking bits of evidence from different types of study. We don't have to take them all from the same place, and we don't have to take them all from the same type of study design either. Because we can, we do use real world evidence. We do use trial outcome evidence. We do, systematic reviews, and we do meta-analyses, and we're collating all this different types of evidence together. We take expert opinion. It all impacts on uncertainty, but we're explicit about that. So yeah. So we're as health economists, we're quite happy to work with whatever we can get our hands on within reason.
Sure. That's a really good answer. So just some of the questions which have been coming on throughout the course of this afternoon. This one was directed towards you, Izzy, but then I'll come to you first, but then if anyone wants to pick up on it, please let me know. And the initial question was, in human safety tests, what's the minimum number of participants required to be statistically significant? Now, I think that's perhaps a bit narrow, and the answer is a little bit, how long's a piece of string? But so if I could just broaden it slightly and say, when it comes to powering a study, and thinking about how many participants you're going to need to have in it, and thinking about your trial design, what sort of considerations would you put into that?
Okay, so I alluded on my very last slide that I suppose you need to think quite carefully about what is the outcome that you're really interested in. So at the end of the day, I'm going to talk about comparative studies because that's often where people in particular think about statistical significance. I know the question originally started off with safety. You will have to end up, if you're looking at a comparator, you've got to say, well, how you're trying to show something's better. What does better mean? At the end of the day, you're going to have a numerical outcome that dictates better. And certainly in a trial setting, you'll probably have to settle on a single outcome. Now that may not be ideal. There may be loads of facets that you want to think about for outcomes, but in terms of powering your trial, thinking about the size of it, you probably do need to focus in on a single outcome to focus on to do these statistical calculations. So you need to think about what your outcome is, and then you need to think about, you need some information about that. So what's the likely kind of range of responses that you might have? So you're changing someone's blood pressure, for example. So you need to think, well, what would we expect their blood pressure to be? How much does that vary across individuals? And how much that varies has a big impact on how large your study needs to be. So if you've got an outcome that's kind of all over the place and can be very wildly different, trying to show a difference between, you know, a technology and something else is quite tricky because they vary a lot anyway. So that's why, as a general rule of thumb, if something varies a lot, you can expect to have to do a big study to show a difference. And obviously vice versa is true. So I think you need to think really carefully about what outcome you're going to focus on. I think there's all sorts of processy type stuff that I mentioned a bit about recruitment, but you will have to think about who are you demonstrating this in. So you're going to go for a very tightly controlled group of patients, or maybe you're more at the end of saying, no, we want to see what this is like in most people. And so your inclusion and exclusion criteria will reflect that. I think it's complicated, and I know it sounds like a complete cop-out, but it's really hard to give hard and fast rules, because you just have to consider your very specific question at the moment in time where your development is at. So I'm sorry not to be able to say something more definitive.
No, yes, I think it does. It actually probably leads me into my next one. But does anyone else want to come in on that? How many participants is enough, and how do you work out how many participants is enough?
So just to add a little bit, so for the preclinical testing and usability, there's been quite a bit of work done around that. Unfortunately, it's not all that many. I mean, there's no doubt that if you want to get very rare errors, then obviously you need to do potentially very large, but that's normally done post-market. So some quite a nice bit of work to show that up to 15 and 20 volunteers going through a detailed protocol does actually give you about 98% of the errors that are likely to occur. So from our perspective, that's very attractive. And that seems to hold pretty much across quite a wide range of different technologies. So I must say we managed to persuade the regulator that's what we should do. I mean, otherwise you potentially could go on forever. If you want to say, well, you want to detect an error that occurs in 1 in a million, then as Izzy will tell you, it's quite a large study, really. So I think one has also to come down to the practicalities of what you can do sometimes, as well as the science. So for us, for a summative usability study, we would go between 15 to 20 volunteers.
That's excellent. Thank you for that, Tom. Anyone else got any thoughts or comments to share on that one? No. Okay. So I think it's kind of building on that, and the term research question has come up quite a lot. And Anastasia, I noticed in I think it was in your talk where you talked about the claims that you're making from the product. Having multiple claims means multiple pieces of evidence. So perhaps I'll come to you on this first. If you're embarking on your evidence generation strategy, what would you think about in terms of defining your research question? We can come to that.
Yeah, and I think up to a certain degree there is a certain level of tension that maybe starts from the relationship the developers and the companies have early on with the funders. I think and other colleagues who are on the panel today and have more experience with kind of evaluating research proposals can comment on this. But I found over the years that there is an attempt to demonstrate as much impact as possible early on, and that sometimes include casting a wider net in the population, trying to be as inclusive as possible in terms of the potential benefits and outline, every little one of them. But obviously, when you come in front to NICE for the evaluation, you need to have evidence to support your claims. And in terms of NICE, when we evaluate the technology, we work with what is called the scope, so the decision problem. And normally the decision problem will focus on what is the population that we feel there is more benefit from this. What are the outcomes that we need to focus, not just for the clinical effectiveness and the safety, but also for the health economics. And it's that bridge, I guess, in terms of NICE evaluation between the clinical effectiveness and the health economics for the guidance production programs, that they have that element that is crucial. I don't think I can give an answer, a generic answer that will cover everyone. I think, as we said previously, you need to go back to your value proposition. And there are tools that we have today, as in frameworks, on working with what is called early or developer focused health technology assessment, that they actually guide you step by step on how to build a value proposition and how to focus on the outcomes that actually matter to prioritize during your evidence generation.
Thank you for that, Anastasia. And I'll just share one thought of my own from my experience with my mHealth, which is one of the main things which enabled my COPD to be successful was picking a very specific outcome, which was looking at pulmonary rehab and could we deliver the same clinical outcomes. So it's a non-inferiority study. Right, we didn't want to show necessarily that we were better, but could we deliver non-inferior outcomes to a face-to-face version of pulmonary rehabilitation? And just answering that research question, and we got the data to show that we were non-inferior. That was tremendously helpful for us. Does anyone else want to come in on this point around defining a research question, deciding what outcome to look at? No? Okay, so let's move it on. So this one's for you, Tom, and it was in the chat. So does the MedTech test on live patients and volunteers as well? And then it's a three-part question. It was funded by the EU Development Fund. How is it now funded? And what's the approximate cost of doing some testing there?
So the answer is, I was going to say rather cynically, we don't do testing on dead patients or dead volunteers, but it's actually, there's quite a serious component to that. So we don't do any cadaveric work. It's one thing we don't do for a variety of reasons. So the answer is yes, we do test on healthy volunteers and we do test on patients. We try, if we can, to test on mannequins, and we have some extremely sophisticated phantoms because there is no requirement then for ethics approvals or other approvals. Certainly if we're going to test on patients that have been identified through the healthcare records, then it goes through the standard HRA REC approvals. And also with volunteers. What has changed a little bit is the MHRA has just written a letter to us, which is unfortunate, to say that if we wish to test even on healthy volunteers, even with low-risk devices, that they would like to be informed around that. I suspect that most people don't do that, but we probably should do that. So the answer is yes, we do. Costs are very dependent on what you want to do at the end of the day. So we were funded for the first 3 years of our existence out of an ERDF grant that funded the building of the centre, which was just over £7 million. We became self-funding in January 2020. We had a rather difficult year last year, as I said, so we've actually spent most of the time testing ventilators. The equipment for that was purchased by the government, but we didn't charge for all that testing. And we're just getting back onto the treadmill of grants and everything else. So we currently hold, I think, 4 I4I-PDA and about 5 or 6 Innovate Awards, all of which we're co-applicants on, and which part funders. So yes, and unfortunately, it doesn't come cheap. I'd love to do it for free. But I have to keep the centre running. I mean, I think the answer is if someone wants a quote for a particular project, the right thing to do is to get in touch with us. I don't think it's right just to give sort of figures out over on air, because it varies massively on what you want to do.
Yeah. And I must say the question which was posed in the chat did say, well done for the MBE at the end of the chat as well. Yeah, I mean, I think just to pick that out as a common theme, because Gurdeep mentioned it and Tom as well, I think any innovators out there, as a take-home message, speak to people and reach out and speak to your health economist, speak to organizations like the AHSNs or Tom's organization there, and get as much input, because these people have been through it and done it many times and will be able to give you really sage advice. I think getting out there and talking about it as much as possible is extremely helpful. Okay, so there's a few questions around this next topic, and this one was actually directed to me in the chat, but I have answered it already, but I thought it'd be nice to get everyone else's views. So thinking at very early stage, and your very initial evidence generation, any practical advice about how to gather some early data, where you might be able to go to get some support, and any way without a huge amount of grant funding or something that you may be able to get some early data behind your product. Would anyone like to come in on that?
Well, I'll kick it off then. So I think that's key. I think particularly if you're going to go for things like NIHR funding, then certainly having done some patient and public work to demonstrate there's a need, to demonstrate there's support is key, and you don't pay a lot of money for that. We run a process, so I'm sure it's true with all the NIHR mix, that there's clearly no charge to talk to us and to give our advice out free of charge. And then we will also, we will do a very limited look-see, if that makes sense. I mean, we're not going to recruit 25 volunteers and do a 5-week study free of charge, but we are prepared to do a quick look-see, video the technology in use, get some feedback, again, without charging, on the basis that there's a gentleman's agreement that we'll go forward for a grant application, and then we will be a co-applicant on that grant application. And I think that does at least try and get the ball rolling without having these very sizable upfront costs. 29,500 medical device SMEs in Europe, average number of employees 2, average bank balance is negative. Once every 11 minutes, one of them goes bankrupt. So we're not seeing large numbers of people with very large bank balances. Sadly, if there are any, we're delighted to talk to them, but sadly, we don't see very many of those. So yes, absolutely, talk to people. There's no cost in that. And we are very happy to provide a limited, but what support we can to get some evidence out there prior to applications.
Very good, thank you. Would anyone else like to pass comment on that?
Well, I think, I mean, it's probably just an expansion really on what your answer was, Harry, but we found that the easiest, well, not the easiest way, the most straightforward way is to do precisely what you did, which is you find a clinician in that particular field who's willing to try it out and ask with a small number of patients, depending on what the intervention is, of course. But very often that's the first step, is just doing that very quick ask. Finding out if it's just feasible, bouncing the idea off that clinician, and they can test not even the entire intervention, but parts of it, and get that feeling from the patients and fellow clinicians of what they think, and that takes it forward, and that gives enough of an evidence to say, okay, it's not a pie in the sky idea. There's something we can go to, and then go to the HSN as an example for one, if it's an industry person to come in, and then they sit with one of our sessions where the industry people come in with what the regulations are needed, what the evaluation team would be looking for, and we can give that free advice to go forward to other centers and direct them to the organizations on the panel.
Just a tiny note of caution. So you may not do that with a medical device or a in vitro diagnostic.
Not diagnostic. Yeah, that's right.
We get I know you weren't saying that. We get people approached us who say, "Oh, we've come with this idea. We've tried it out on a few patients." One of them was Ali, was an orthopedic surgeon who invented his own implant and stuck it in a few people on the basis they were private patients and therefore weren't covered by any degree of ethics. Utterly extraordinary. So I'm afraid however non-invasive it is, if it's going to become a medical device, which is essentially a commercialization with something with a medical claim, then I'm afraid you may not try it out on patients for a bit of a look-see. Just as I know you won't say that, but just as a bit of a warning around that. Okay.
Yeah. Any other final thoughts on that one? I think one thing I'd like to add, part of my role on the Clinical Entrepreneur Programme at NHS England is mentoring on lean startup methodology. And one of the big things I'm a proponent of is building a minimum viable product. And that doesn't mean that you need to build a fancy app. Your MVP is basically testing a simple hypothesis, and it can be sometimes as simple as a PowerPoint slide. right? Or a simple form which you ask people to complete. So thinking creatively, not making your own implant and sticking it into people, which sounds slightly terrifying. But particularly for the software products, there's often ways that you can get some early feedback and data, which will support product development, if nothing else, without spending huge sums of money. So I think I know we're just slightly late starting, so I think we'll just try and fit in a couple more quick questions. So I think you've just referred to this as well, Tom, but Anastasia, perhaps for you, can someone please weigh in on digital health technologies that are meant as monitoring rather than diagnostic or treatment, and what sort of clinical evidence has NICE seen for these sorts of digital health technologies?
Yeah, thank you, Harry. And I've added a couple of comments in the chat as well about this. I guess one big question that probably is on everyone's mind is how different evidence generated for digital health technologies need to be from non-digital health technologies, MedTech. And I guess my view on that is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel on everything. NICE has evaluated in the past quite a few diagnostics that they had a monitoring component, and actually a couple of them, I posted them on the chat, also, they will be characterized as digital health technologies, with a kind of more traditional sense of the term. So you can look into this and read the discussion, read the committee's kind of deliberation about the evidence and what they would like to see, and we do expect in the next, I guess, couple of years that we have more digital health technologies products evaluated with NICE, and some of them will feature a monitoring component. But yeah, if there is one take-home message, is that we don't need to reinvent the requirement for study design in all cases for digital health technologies. There are lessons learned that we know from evaluations done at NICE already.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anastasia. So I think we're probably at time, and I'm probably going to get told off by the event organizers if I delay us any further. I think it just leaves me to say an enormous thank you for all of the speakers for giving up their time and sharing their insights with us. It's been a really interesting session, and great to hear from you all. So thank you very much for your time, and I think we'll close it there. Thank you all.